Hello, Jeff.
Hi, Chris.
Hi there. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I heard about your book. I thought I need to get this guy on a podcast, interview him, basically to see what on earth what has gone on with his life, because it's really fascinating. You have a book coming out about your life. You emailed me the first chapter, which I've read, and to say it's an eye opener is an understatement for sure. It's very interesting, very rich in terms of how you describe what actually happened. It's very raw, but we'll get onto that later. For now, because for those who don't know who you are, can you just say who you are and just briefly your journey up until this point and why you decided to write a book about your life?
Well, I'm Jeff Schoep, and I was involved in white supremacy and neo-Nazi movements for 27 years. For 25 of those years, I was the national leader of the National Socialist Movement, which, by the time I left the organization, it was the largest neo-Nazi party in the United States. Um, so that was the vast majority of my adult life, unfortunately. And in 2019. I broke free from that world and changed my life around, and since then I've been speaking out against hate and racism and working to peace build and human rights.
Okay, so let's start like a good story at the beginning. What was about your upbringing that led you to have these thoughts? Was it anything unusual about your childhood that led to it? Any particular incidents, or what led to you having those thoughts in the first place?
Well, when you look at when people are looking from the outside looking in at these type of people that get involved in this kind of stuff, they quite often think, there's got to be some trauma. We've all had trauma, of course, but they think that there's, you can place this in a box, and in a lot of cases, different things, trauma, different incidents that happen to somebody can spur that. In my case, it was a little different. It was a historical family connection that got me involved now, and I have to say that with a caveat because it wasn't my family that pushed this or indoctrinated me or anything like that. In fact, it was quite the opposite. But my background is basically I started becoming fascinated with neo-Nazism by the time I was in the fourth grade. My grandfather, my mother, my grandparents, they had come over from Germany, so first generation here in the United States. Um, and my grandfather had fought in the German army during World War II. My great uncles had fought as well, and I knew that growing up. And German was spoken in my grandparents' home and between my mother and them and as well. So it wasn't hidden from us as kids, but it was this fascination that I had with that aspect of our family history that kind of was the spark, I guess you could say. And I became fascinated with Nazism as a child, and then I wanted to get involved as soon as I could. So by the time I was a teenager, I joined the movement.
Okay, so I know kids or people in the I know probably teenagers in late teens, for instance, that have an interest in true crime, but that wouldn't necessarily mean they would go out and commit the crime and to have interest in the crime. So yes, you say you joined that movement, but what what was the point where it became went from an interest to actually you've had a process of "Oh, actually I want to join this group?
Yeah, I mean, as long as I can remember, I wanted to get involved in it. I didn't know what that necessarily looked like in the United States. So I had to search out the movement back in those days. Today, unfortunately, you can click on a few buttons on the internet and find these groups. Back then, you had to search it out. So I was actually searching out these kind of groups and wrote to as many as I could find and joined and got active. And it was after I had gotten active, because I wasn't raised in a home that was taught racism or hate or anti-Semitism or anything like that. Um, it was after I actually joined that I became indoctrinated into the ideology, and then started, hating people and things of that nature. But in the mindset of where I sat in my mindset, and where a lot of people that are involved in this shit is they think they're doing something good and noble. So I was of this, I wanted to do something, be part of something that was greater than myself. I wanted to do something grand and noble and serve a noble cause. And again, with a caveat, I say that knowing now that it certainly wasn't a noble and good cause, but um, at the time, that was the driving force, was to do something for my country, to do something for my race, and be part of this movement. And that was the outlook, unfortunately.
Your family, you said, didn't indoctrinate you into this, but did they have any non-white friends, or at least were there any non-white people who were very significant in their life, be it at work or neighbors and stuff like that? And if so, what were they thinking when you started to join this movement?
Where I grew up was in rural Minnesota, so it was in a really almost like I would say desolate type of area. It was a farming community way out in the country. There was not a lot of people of other races or anything like that were out there. They did have one set of friends who it was an interracial couple, and they were always good to me. They were always nice to me. So it wasn't anything that I was brought up around or anything like that. It was the indoctrination came later, so it wasn't. But I didn't have the experiences with a lot of people of different races growing up because of how the area that we lived in. There just wasn't very many minorities at all in that area. In the summertime, you'd have farm workers that would come up from Mexico, but a lot of times they would end up going back. They would just come up for the summer to work the fields, and they would head back down to Texas or to Mexico later on. So there was just not a lot of people of different races in our area.
So talk the process of when you first joined the group. What was that process like? Did you have to do initiation? Did you have to prove your loyalty to them? Did you ask questions like, what was the actual process in becoming a member of that group?
So, I mean, the processes are, between different groups are various. I'd basically got involved, and you fill out an application, like you're applying for a job, sort of. And you fill out this application, you meet with the organization, which is what I did, and then you become active at that point. So I'd met with the different groups that were in. By this point of my life, I was living in the Twin Cities, so there was people of all different races and backgrounds there um, when I joined. And at that point, it was pretty simple. You signed up an application, you got active with the group, and then I worked up my way up through the ranks, and I became a local group leader at first, and from there, within a couple years, I was asked to run the organization.
So what did the local group leader involve? What duties did you have? Was that more about recruitment and helping other people like settle in?
So, what were the responsibilities? Like, what does a local group leader
Yeah, yeah,
do?
yeah.
So, yeah, recruitment was one part of it. When I first joined, the head of the organization at the time was showing us something he called the one man picket. And the group was pretty small when I joined, but the reason I joined this specific group is because of its ties. It was a very old organization. It was tied to the original commander of the American Nazi Party, the founder of the American Nazi Party, George Lincoln Rockwell. This was the National Socialist Movement was a split from that organization, and the guy that was running it at the time had served with Rockwell. So again, that historical fascination is what drew me specifically to this group. There was other groups around that had younger people more my age that I would have probably more naturally gravitated to, but it was that historical connection that really spurred me on. So when I got involved, he showed us the one man picket. We went to downtown Minneapolis, and he unfurled a swastika flag and marched around in front of a government building down there. And the point of that was to show us that even one man could have an impact, and to show us how it was done, basically. And so we learned recruitment skills early on, and that I got active, and I was recruiting a lot of people. So I rose up through the ranks rather quickly.
Yeah. Unveiling a swastika, I imagine, I always get these two mixed up. Is it the First Amendment when it comes to free speech? Is that the one, or is that the Second Amendment?
Yeah, in the United States, it's one of our amendments where you have free speech and freedom of expression. So as long as you're not threatening to, like, if you said, like, hey, I'm going to come and harm you, that guy over there in the blue hat, or something specific, then you can get in trouble. But you could say all kinds of things if it was a generalization, or if it wasn't a direct act of violence. In the United States, you have freedom of speech and freedom of expression.
So, with that in mind, when you're unfurling this flag, I imagine it must have terrified people, but obviously because of laws, the police couldn't really do anything. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, there's nothing the police could do about it, and that was something that I had learned early on as well. That a lot of times you had to have permits for like a rally or a march or things like that. But this was another lesson: was this was a walking picket. You could form a walking picket anywhere, and you could not be arrested. So as long as you kept moving, like if you stood sedentary in front of a place and you're just standing there, maybe you could get in trouble because you're not moving. But if you're moving, even if it's in circles, that's a walking picket. So we learned a lot of the laws and how what we could do and what we couldn't do. The organization that I was a part of was what you would constitute an above ground organization, so it had to fall within the laws of the US. Now, I say that again with a caveat. There was a lot of things that weren't legal that went on as well, but uh, the organization itself was above ground. It was a legal organization in the country.
What other tools did your group use to help recruit people? Did they write leaflets? Did they film videos? What other tools did they use to try and recruit people?
So over the years, it was basically anything and everything you can imagine. In the early years, like when I got involved, was back in the early '90s. Leaflets, a lot of the old school type of things. Sometimes newspapers. Some groups had newspapers, so we would get newspapers in bulk and pass out the newspapers. A lot of old school techniques back then. Later on, it evolved. Um, Starting back then, actually, and probably before I got involved, there was a lot of bands that were promoting the music. So that was something that I didn't know about when I first joined, and I met up with Skinhead Band, and started learning about how people were putting music to this stuff. And propaganda wise, someone might watch a speech once or twice, maybe a couple times, or read a book once, but you might listen to a favorite song over and over and over again. So propaganda wise, this was very effective, the music, as far as bringing people in. Later on, it became, getting involved in making video games, racist video games, you name it. The propaganda reach changed. In the '90s, it was one thing, but the internet was fairly new. So the groups under my leadership early on, we had one of the first websites, not the first, but early on, it was one of the first organizations that had websites up, and started learning how to use that phone hotlines to recruit, so people could call in and get a hold of us, join up, and later on producing podcasts and radio shows and things of that nature.
I'm just listening to you now, and obviously, like I said before, I read the first chapter. And one thing that's coming across is that group, whatever anyone thinks of it, it seems very organized in terms of the law, in terms of, well, one, was it organized? And two, did you have weapons as well? Was it that one of the things that you had?
Well, when I first joined, it was basically there in Minnesota and in a couple other states. It was a pretty small organization, but so learning as I went, I trained under the guy that had run the organization. I learned a lot from him within a couple years, but within a couple years, I was appointed to run the group. So I had to learn a lot of things, like, sort of like a trial by fire. I had to make mistakes and things of that nature, but I implemented handbooks and a structure in the organization, basically set it up like a military type structure with ranks and positions. It wasn't a democracy, so people were appointed. They weren't voted into positions or anything like that. And I set up structure as far as rules, regulations, what you can and can't do, and that evolved over the years. And But yes, it was highly structured. Not at first, it wasn't, but it became highly structured, and over the years, it evolved to. And this surprises a lot of people that it was a state nonprofit. Now, it wasn't a federal or national nonprofit because um, what I found out when trying to register for that is if you discriminate based on race or anything like that, you can't have a federal nonprofit. Means you don't have tax exempt status and things of that nature. But it was set up as a state nonprofit with a board of directors and everything like that. So that surprises a lot of people because when they think of these type of groups, they automatically assume, this is just a bunch of rednecks or hillbillies out in the woods, coming up with this club, and it was not like that. It was very, very structured. It became a well-oiled machine over the years, and I don't say that with any sense of pride. In fact, I say it with a lot of regret and shame. But it is what it was. That's how I operated.
In, going back to what you said about recruitment, was there a particular age that you targeted in terms of recruitment?
No, not specifically. Now there was the different groups you had. I noticed a lot of the different groups had people of specific ages. Like a lot of the skinhead groups, obviously, were teens to late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s, maybe. But after you're 40 years old, not too many guys are running around calling themselves skinheads anymore. So they would be a lot of those guys were in other organizations or older organizations. But the National Socialist movement, excuse me, National Socialist movement had people of all different ages. So you had 18, 19-year olds, 20s, middle age, and you had old people, like senior citizens that were very old. And this was something like over the years when I did interviews, especially with people would come over from Europe and things like that, they would be like, this is a very different organization because you have young people next to old people and everything in between, where a lot of the groups were set in a certain age bracket. So it had some unique structure in ways like that. It had females in leadership positions, which a lot of the groups didn't do. And there was some different things like that were different than other groups.
Going to the chapter that you emailed me and reading that chapter, did you have to take a pledge of loyalty um, in order to once you were in the group? Like, was it one of those where once you were in, you couldn't leave? Like, how did that work?
That's a really good question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that, um, Chris. There was a pledge of loyalty that we had that was put in the membership handbooks, where you had to pledge to the organization and to the commander, the head, the leader of the organization. And so there was oaths and loyalty, oaths of loyalty that were expected to be taken by the memberships. By the membership. Later on, there was also a probationary period that was introduced where a person couldn't have the patch. You'd get patched in, so to speak, like a lot of bike clubs and movement groups also use that too. It's to basically weed out people that might not be a good fit for the organization, whether they were sent in as a spy, or they're mentally unstable, or overly violent, or something that, or weren't following the rules or regulations. So that was put into place to, see if before someone was walking around with our patch on, we had to kind of know who they were. They had to be around and people had to vouch for them. So there was a structure like that in place. But as far as leaving, this varies from group to group. The group that I was in, you could leave, you could say you were going to leave, and you could leave. It wasn't like the group would come after you or anything like that. Now, some of the prison-based organizations, a lot of those groups will come after you if you leave. So you're pledged in. That's it. So, but that really varies from organization to organization. The one I was involved in, you could leave and walk away.
Just to lead on something you just said there, you talked about spy. How often were there spies in a group? Would people try to infiltrate the group? And I'm not just talking about undercover police officers, but others who may have infiltrated the group for whatever reasons they may have had.
There was tons of I say spies, but spies, undercovers, informants, whatever you want to call them. You know, they weren't all undercover officers or law enforcement. Sometimes there was people from like groups like Antifa that would infiltrate. So um, I learned early on in the 90s after we had been infiltrated and we found out that we were infiltrated because it broke out into a big violent fight in downtown St. Paul, that it was time for us to start doing counterintelligence operations. So I spearheaded counterintelligence operations, had people even from different races infiltrating Antifa and groups like that as well. So I figured, you know, it had happened to us. I didn't want that to happen again, so I was stepping it up and infiltrating groups on the other side. But even with that, you are still always going to have informants. I operated under the principle that there was always somebody, at least one informant at any meeting. You could have 20 people in a room or 15 people in a room, and at least one of them was somebody undercover, and you might not know who. You might not ever know who. They were easier to detect back in the 90s, but it's like their modus operandi, the way they operated, changed and evolved, and it got smarter over the years. Early on, they were easy to detect because typically they come in and advocate illegal activity right off the bat, and then you got rid of them. You threw them out, cast them out. Later on, early on, my thought process was that you could find any infiltrator within 6 months, but in being involved in this for 27 years, I can tell you later on we found informants that had been undercover for many years, and that was not the way it was back in the 90s. It changed over the years, and it wasn't something that was strictly happening to the NSM. It was happening to other groups as well. Every single group, if you were active and you had more than a handful of members, you were infiltrated. That's just the way you had to know that, and anybody that thought different was a fool, because there was always a lot of them.
So that must have led to a lot of distrust during your time in the group as well.
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, you know, you read the first chapter of the book. I mean, that is about basically um not necessarily somebody that infiltrated, but somebody that switched sides as they were involved. And you know, we don't know if he was specifically sent in to infiltrate or if he just flipped at some point or what exactly went down, but a message was sent that that sort of behavior wasn't going to be tolerated.
Yeah. So, what ways would you try and circumvent that? In other words, were there really thorough checks? Were there certain language that you would use so you would disguise what you were saying? Like, what techniques were used to try and basically stop or at least limit the number of infiltrators in the group?
Hmm. There, you know, I thought about a lot of this when I was writing the book as well, and like I didn't want to get into exact tactics
Yeah.
because I didn't want to put out a blueprint of how I operated, because I think a lot of groups could learn stuff from it. So I can answer some of those kind of questions like sort of vague, but I don't want to make a blueprint for people that are trying to, you know, say if leaders of these groups are listening and going, "Oh, I never thought of that." You know, that's the worst thing we could do is like hand them a blueprint on how to do it. But there was a lot of different things that were done to try to sort people out and things of that nature. And none of them were foolproof, but there was different ways. One of the things that I'd implemented after a while was like background checks. So you could, and this I can talk about a little bit, but basically, you know, you'd run criminal background checks on people. And again, this wasn't foolproof, but if you saw like a guy that had many arrests and he was doing very little time in prison or jail for serious crimes, chances are that person had cut a deal and was working for law enforcement in some way, shape, or form, because that sort of thing was pretty commonplace, where somebody would get in trouble, then they would flip, and that was something that we look for. So that wouldn't always show up, like you're not going to do a background check on somebody and it's not going to say, "Hey, informant." It's
Yeah.
that doesn't happen. But you look for the telltale signs, like somebody that had been in lots of criminal trouble and did very little time. There's a reason for that. That doesn't happen, especially if you're active or known in the movement. Usually you were getting longer sentences and harsher sentences, and not lesser.
Mm. Yeah, I'm just wondering, in terms of your views, not just views, the group you're in, their views towards people of colour, for instance, it might be obvious to anyone watching this what they would be, but in terms of campaigns, did you have targeted campaigns against particular people of colour? And I don't know if you can go into it in a book or you can go into it, but what would be the reasons for those people being targeted? Would they look at you the wrong way? Would they just do something you wouldn't like? Like, how would that work?
So, like, how did the group choose like who its enemies were, or that sort of thing? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
In the movement, the greatest enemy of the movement is the Jews. I mean, it was bad, as far as that goes. Like, I would even say, in the last years that I was involved in it, I would tell people that I wasn't a racist. I didn't have any hate for different races and things like that, but I was a raging anti-Semite, and which is ironic because I do a lot of work with the Jewish community now, and a lot of my closest friends are Jewish. So it's there's quite an irony there, but it does vary from group to group. Like the Ku Klux Klan, for example, black people are the biggest villains in their eyes quite often. But in the neo-Nazi movements, it's the Jews, and but all the other races fall under the enemy list too. It's just there's different levels of enemy, so to speak. So it's like, in their mind, the Jewish people are at the top, and then other races are below that, and white race traders, who, people that are against the movement, fall into those categories as well. Sometimes above, like right below the Jews, is how they view it. So when you think of these, hate groups and things like that, they don't get along with anybody. And a lot of the violence that was experienced, that I experienced over the years, was not just, well, it was fighting the far left and, Antifa communists and different people like that, anarchists in the streets, but also just as much violence, sometimes more or close to as much, within the group or with other rival factions, was taking place as well. So um, if in this fantasy world where these groups think they're going to come to power or things like that, there was always talk, of, where infighting over religion. And this is one of the things that I had put down in the handbooks as a rule. Like, religion was not something for the group. Like, it was something that you could have for church and home, in private. That it was not to be proselytized in the group. It was not to be forced on anybody else, because you had different religions, different religious beliefs within the group, and those uh, would fight amongst each other. They'd say, like, well, once the race war is done, or once the civil war is done, then we'll sort it out, and we'll go after the pagans, or we'll go after the Christians, or so on and so forth. They would openly talk about it. And it's like, I thought the guy next to you was supposed to be your brother. Like, what are you're gonna go after them, and handle them after all the rest of the enemies are gone. It was like nonstop, being at war with the world, is the best way I explain it. Like, today, when I do talks at schools, and especially with school kids, I tell them, it's like, you woke up every single day and you're at war with the world. That's what that life is like.
So while all this is going on, what was, bearing in mind your family weren't the people who led you to this path, but what was your relationship with them at this time? Because they must be thinking, what on earth is Jeff doing? This is crazy, crazy.
It was devastating to my family. Early on, when I was first involved, politics wasn't my main thing, like what I wanted to do with my life was I was a musician. I was a singer in a rock and roll, long-haired rock and roll band, if you can imagine that.
Mm.
Like Motley Crue and that kind of music we played. And I was on a radio show for an interview and I was doxxed live on the air. This is in the early 90s, mid 90s. And that sort of changed my trajectory. And what happened in that when I was doxxed was it wasn't just me that was doxxed, which that ended my music career and changed the trajectory for me. But my mother, my father, where they lived was put out on the air. And my mother was an attorney, and she was not long after that, she was running to be a judge in the state and was elected to be a judge. And there's a formality. This is the way she explained it to me at the time, that in the state of Minnesota, where we were from, the governor had to sign off on all the new judges. And usually it's just a signature and there you go, the people elected you. So that's how it works. And my mother explained to me she got a phone call from the governor, and the governor had said, "Mrs. Schoep, your father fought in the German army during World War II. Your son's a leader in the neo-Nazi movement. I don't feel you're fit to be a judge in this state." So she was never like, my involvement in this garbage like destroyed my mother's career. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more. My sister had issues with jobs, threats. My father had law enforcement showing up at his place of business, different things of that nature. It was really hard on the family, and it was tough. It was you'd think when something like that's happening that young Jeff would have like looked in the mirror and said, "Look what you're doing to your family. Like, look at what is happening. Look at the price that they are paying for your involvement." But I doubled down every time I was pushed or I felt the proverbial lash of the whip. I felt like instead of changing my ways, I dug my heels and I became more angry, more defiant, more determined to go after the system that I felt like was wronging and now targeting my family who had nothing to do with this stuff. Even my grandfather that fought in the German army at one point, um, not early on, but quite a while into my involvement, he had said to me, he says, "Jeff, this path that you're on is going to lead to one of two places, prison or death." And I was so radical at the time, and this was somebody I looked up to and everything. And I was so radical at the time, I was like, you know what? You might have given up, but I'll never stop fighting. I'll fight till my last dying breath. That was my disrespectful answer to my grandfather, and nobody could get through to me.
Did you see the group you're in as almost a second family, especially after what happened with your family and they rejecting you because of this? Did you see that other group as your family now?
Yes, those that's very common. For people that are involved in it, it becomes like your family, and it's all you know. And I was fortunate in the sense where my family did not complete my mother didn't talk to me for what felt like years after that happened to her. I don't know how long. I get asked that quite often, like how long was it? I really don't know. It felt like forever. I think it was a couple 2 3 years though that she barely spoke to me. My dad never cut me off, and then I repaired things with my mother and everything, so I was able to stay, still have a relationship with my family. We just agreed like not to talk politics, because when you get involved in this sort of stuff, like early on, I was trying to recruit my parents and everything, and I'm thinking I'm part of this movement. I'm going to recruit everybody, and it was ridiculous. But the best way I can explain it is it's like a cult.
Mm.
I didn't like that reference. In fact, I despised that reference when I was involved in it. Different girls that I was dating, one after another, like literally one after the other. They're all saying, if they'd come to a meeting or something, they're like, "This is a cult. You're like the cult leader. This is a cult." And I'd get angry about it. And I was just thinking, man, why am I making these bad choices in women? What is wrong with these girls that I'm picking? I can't see it. It's me that's the problem, but I can't see it. So you just become more and more radicalized. And a lot of the folks, they cut off their families or their families cut them off. So now they have no choice, or they feel like they have no choice. There's always a choice, but you feel like it because this is your world. It's an echo chamber. It's like this bubble, and you don't venture outside that bubble. You're behind these walls, and you don't, venture out because it's safe in there. You're with your people, and that's how you feel. So it's and this isn't something that's unique to Nazi organizations. This is unique to all extremist organizations, which is something that I learned after I got out, because I thought it was very unique. I thought this is just these groups. But what I've learned in doing the work that I'm doing now and helping others de-radicalize and change their lives is across the spectrum, far left, far right, religious extremism, groups like Al Qaeda or ISIS, um, and cults, they're all holding people in there. Their structures are very much the same. The psychological drivers are very much the same. The politics are all over the place different, but the structures of how they hold people in place is all very similar. Gangs are similar in some ways, but there's some differences. But we help people leave gangs as well because there's enough similarities there that these things are all linking up. Same with cults.
I was going to say, after since you left, I imagine you, especially what you've been through, you see groups, well, similarities between, like I say, what you went through and groups like Antifa now or other political movements. Not necessarily in the extreme way you're doing it, it happened to you, but just in terms of, like you say, the step-by-step guide in terms of how these groups operate.
What is the question
So
exactly?
I'm just saying, do you see similarities between what you went through and then groups like operating now? And I don't necessarily mean neo-Nazi groups. It could be anyone, anything like Antifa, how like the far left, the far right, people who are classed as, I don't like this word, but woke. Do you see similarities in terms of, not in terms of what they believe, but more in terms of the group devotion that each member has to go through?
100%. Yes, that's what I was trying to explain, is that's the similarity. Is there's so much similar, because I thought, well, I can help people leave the far right because that's what I was involved in for so many years. But what I've learned is, by seeing the structure and other people that have struggled, that have come out of these different groups, and having these relationships, and how we've helped people leave that, is that there is so many similarities. Again, the politics or the ideologies are all over the place, but the ways that they're held into place in these groups, and the ways that these groups kind of isolate you from your loved ones, your people that you knew before, you become very isolated once you get involved in these, and it's an echo chamber.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, definitely. I can imagine that, especially like I say, even when you've been in relationships, like you say, and you have girlfriend after girlfriend telling you, actually, this is a cult, and you're just, I wouldn't even say just blinkered, blind, whatever you want to call it. There's no one there to reflect back to you to say, actually, this is this is just wrong. It seems like you seemed very all encompassing once you were in that cult.
It becomes everything, your whole world. There was people, like, I would watch Hollywood movies and listen to mainstream music. I didn't just listen to the movement's music, but there was people that I knew that, I'm not going to watch that movie because it's Jewish, or it has black people or brown people in it, or things like that. I'm not. I knew people that wouldn't go to ethnic restaurants and eat the foods because it wasn't white. Like, and even when I was still involved, I sort of got where I thought that was kind of funny, because some of it was just so extreme. So I would always say, if we were going out to dinner or something after a rally, I'd pick a Mexican restaurant or something like that. And there was always people that were like, "Why are we going to a Mexican restaurant?" And they get all angry and upset. And I said, "Who doesn't like tacos? Come on, like."
Yeah.
But I was the one that was kind of standing out in that sense, because there was always people that got angry about that. And so that's just an example. But yeah, it was really all encompassing.
because of your actions and your membership of this group, did you specifically, or personally, I should say, get in trouble with the police? And if so, was it something that happened a lot?
What was the last part of the question?
Did you get in trouble with the police when you were in this group? And if so, was that something that happened a lot to you?
Well, I mean, I don't know, like get in trouble with the police. We had to meet with the police a lot to do rallies and things like that because of the when we would file for permits, we'd have to meet with state capitol police or local police departments and things like that. But as far as like getting in trouble, there was when I was young and we were walking around with baseball bats and things like that, yeah, police would roll up on us a lot. They would shake us down for weapons and things of that nature. But as far as like getting in trouble, it kind of varies based on person on person. Like I wasn't getting in a lot of legal trouble personally, but there was some people that did, that would constantly, do stupid things and get in legal trouble. But the cops were always in general, the FBI and different law enforcement agencies, they watch these groups like no tomorrow. They watch you like a hawk. So you are always under some sort of we just always just I always assumed we were under surveillance and I tell a few stories about that. I give a few examples about that in my book about some of the uh, I could write probably 10 books on all the informants and infiltrator attempts that we had thwarted. And that's just ones we found, like there was a whole lot more that we probably never discovered. But there's a few stories of some really wild instances that are covered in the book about people doing undercover thing. And I'll tell you one more if you got a minute, I can share
Yeah,
one another one that I'm just thinking about now. Early on, before I was in charge of the organization, we had gotten a phone call and this story is in the book, and a guy had said he wanted to donate some weaponry to us, and I was like 19, I think, at the time, really young. And I'm thinking, oh, cool, military weapons. This sounds great. Not thinking anything besides that, like, oh, this will help us for our training and things like that. It would be pretty cool. 19-year-old kid. That sounds great. But I had returned the phone call to this individual and I was like, well, this is above my pay grade. I can't accept these without, you're going to have to meet with the boss, so we set up a meeting and I wasn't able to make that decision because I wasn't in charge of the group. And we went and met at a local restaurant and it turned out, long story short, this guy was undercover and was trying to set us up, and we didn't take the bait. And I didn't really realize what happened until after the guy kind of stormed out. And the head of the organ and I said to the head of the organization, I said, what was that all about? Like, why'd you grab the guy's wrist? And well, you saw his badge is what it turned out to be. And he says, he goes, you didn't just get entrapped and you're not going to prison. That's what just happened. So if we would have accepted those weapons, which he said, were surplus from military installation, that would have been years and years in prison. And that's just one instance. So I learned really early on that we were always being watched and monitored, and that you couldn't trust anybody around you. You're calling these people your brothers and sisters, but you don't know that you can trust them because they could be trying to set you up. And that same tactic that was utilized on us was also utilized in another situation. I believe it was in Southern California, on another group, and they took the bait, and those guys went to prison.
incredible.
Yep.
Just thinking, you were in that organization for over 25 years. You've got people there who you say are family, some of your friends, but obviously out of that organization now, what was it that made you think, actually, you know what, this life isn't for me. I can't deal with this anymore. Was it one particular incident? Was it a whole range of things that you thought, no, enough's enough? Why did you decide to turn your back on that?
It for me, for most people that are involved, and for me too, it was a whole series of different things. It took time. Um, I can think of maybe a handful of people where it was just one instance, like one act of kindness. Um, I had a local group leader that at one point, he had called me up when I was still running the organization, and he says, "I'm done. I'm out." And I was like, "Wow, this is a guy that was covered in white power tattoos and had done time and all this kind of stuff." And I thought, and it was a fairly good recruiter. And I said, "What's going on? Why are you quitting?" And his car had broke down on the side of a road somewhere. Nobody would stop. Pretty scary looking guy anyways, like most people wouldn't stop. And it happened to be a black man stopped, helped him get his car on the road, and he didn't have the money for it or anything. And basically, this guy helped, this complete stranger helped him. And he says, "I couldn't get a hold of none of my brothers or sisters in the organization, and a stranger stopped to help me. And that stranger was black. How can I stay involved in something like this and hate people that a complete stranger would do something like that for me?" And I wish that was my story, like one instance of kindness. Um, would have changed my trajectory, but it didn't. It took quite a few years. Like I first started having doubts, I would say, in around that I can pinpoint anyways, like by 2016. And it took me until early 2019 to leave. For me, there was a lot of things that were holding me in place there, but I was de-radicalizing while I was still involved, and that's not the way to do it. The idea is to get away from the group that you're involved in and then work on de-radicalization. Disengage, then de-radicalize. My journey was backwards. I was de-radicalizing while I was still in. And had you met me in, like, say 2016, 2017, and you said, "Jeff, I think you might be de-radicalizing," those would have been fighting words. I would have been like, "You are full of it. No way am I de-radicalizing. That's a bunch of crap." I wouldn't have saw it, I wouldn't have acknowledged it, and I wouldn't have believed it. But after getting out and piecing things back together and looking at the trajectory, that's exactly what was happening. Because at this point, like, I'm telling the press and everybody else, I'm trying to rebrand the group. I'm not using, it was 2016, we started using an odal rune instead of a swastika for public events. And I'm telling people, including the press, this is a white civil rights organization. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but I really believed it. So when I talk today, like when I talk with school kids and things like that, I said what I was doing was putting lipstick on a pig. You can put lipstick on a pig and try to make it look pretty, but it's still a pig after all. And that's what I was doing. But I didn't see it that way at the time. I just thought, this is going to be more palatable. This is going to be better for the public. And we're not a hate group. And even after I left, there was people that were like, "You're not a hateful person. Why are you saying that you were involved in a hate group?" And they were mad because I was, saying that it was hate group. Well, you have to break it down. It is hateful, but I wasn't seeing that at that point in time. But what it was that there was a lot of series of events that took place where I started seeing the humanity in others. But where I pinpoint one of those first seeds was a man by the name of Daryl Davis, who's like brother. He's like
Yeah,
family to
very
me.
well.
Daryl.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So it was meeting Daryl, and I didn't know I was going to meet Daryl. All I knew was this documentary film had contacted me. I did a check on them, and they seemed like a legit company. And they said I was going to sit down for this interview. I said, "Okay, that sounds good." I did all kinds of things like that because I wanted to put out the propaganda of the movement. So I was going to sit down with anybody as long as it wasn't like Jerry Springer or something, or something of that nature. So I'm sitting outside this cafe down in Mississippi or Alabama, I think it was Alabama, with my girl, and this big black man walks up and puts out his hand and he says, "Hi, I'm Daryl Davis. You must be Jeff Schoep." And I shook his hand and I'm thinking, I know that name and I know that face too, but I can't place it. I could not place it yet. Like, because we knew who he was in the movement, like he was a bad guy because he was pulling people out of the movement.
Mhm.
And but it didn't click for me when I was first there. And we're getting along, we're talking about all kinds of things. He's a musician, that's what he's known for. He played with Elvis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry, and so we're talking all about music, and then it clicks. was like, this, I know who this guy is. This is the guy that gets people out of the Klan and stuff. So I started getting, I'm like, we're getting along a little too well here in this interview. This is going to look bad on TV. I better step this up, So I raise my voice. I start getting a little more aggressive, and I'm saying like, I'll fight to the last bullet for my people, Daryl. Daryl doesn't react. He just sort of sits back and goes, okay, and just continues the conversation like I didn't even raise my voice. I'm really drawn in. I'm like, what is going on here? I'm trying to figure this guy out, and excuse me. So then, he had asked me all kinds of questions about what I believed in and all that. And then he says, "Do you want to know why I do what I do?" And I said, "Yeah." So he started telling me about how racism affected him as a child growing up. And he's 11 years old. He's in a Boy Scout parade, was the only black child in the parade, and white adults are throwing rocks at him. And he goes, they rush him out of there. He goes home. He's all banged up, and his parents are like, "Daryl, what happened?" And he's like, I don't, some people didn't like the Boy Scouts. They're throwing rocks at us. And his parents had to explain to him, "No, Daryl, they were throwing rocks at you because you're black." And Daryl says, "Jeff, I never disbelieved my parents ever until that day. That day I was sure of it. They're lying to me. They are absolutely lying. That is the dumbest thing I ever heard. That didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. They're lying. That doesn't make sense. How can somebody hate me when they don't even know me? How can somebody hate me when they don't even know me?" Man, that hit me like a ton of bricks. All those years, family, friends, everybody that I knew tried to dissuade me from the movement. Not once did anybody ever approach me like that. I saw the humanity in the man sitting across from me. I saw Daryl's humanity in that moment. I saw the person, not the enemy, not the skin color, not any of this BS. I saw his humanity. And when you dehumanize another human being, you lose your humanity in the process. I had lost mine a long dang time ago. And he cracked that window open. And I felt empathy. I felt bad. I felt like first my mind went to, what if somebody would have done that to one of my kids? How would I have handled it? And that's an answer I don't want to give on here because it
Yeah.
would have been bad. But I thought about that, and then I thought about. Then you try to disassociate from it, and you go, "Well, it wasn't anybody in my group. I didn't do that. It must have been. No, it was just some scumbag. That's not the movement." But you can only do that so much, and see, that's the thing. Just like with all the mass shootings and things like that happened, that movement people were behind. If it happened once, you could dismiss it, like not dismiss it, but you could try to explain it away and say, like, whenever stuff like that took place, I would always try to compartmentalize and say there was a crazy person. Okay, once, twice, even three times, maybe a crazy people, right? This was happening over and over and over and over again. And it's the ideology that drives people to do that sort of thing. Now, if you're already mentally unstable or you have some issues like that, that can only exasperate it and make it worse. So, of course, there's different factors that come to play in there. But when you have a radical ideology like that, and then you take somebody that's already kind of unstable in different ways or struggling with different things, um, it only makes it worse.
Yeah, yeah, I can certainly imagine. And from what you're saying, it almost seemed like you were going through stages of denial almost. Oh, I know you said about hit you like a ton of bricks, but this has been your life for about over 25 years. To actually subconsciously click onto that, there must be another thought that's going, if I do this, I'm going to lose all my family, in quotes unquotes, and wow, that must have given you a sense of loneliness when that happened.
Right. Well, I didn't leave right then, and that was it. I met Daryl in 2016, and soon after that, I met a Muslim filmmaker in a similar situation that also uh, approached me in a similar manner. And I had spent a lot more time with her because she went across the country with me to rallies and different things like that. And I saw her humanity as well. And still I didn't leave. So it took me a little bit of time and I was struggling, because I wanted to fix it at first. I was like, okay, this isn't a hate group, it's a white civil rights group. I'm trying to convince myself and the world of that, and I'm trying to change things. And I really beat myself up over this for a long time. And Daryl had said to me, he says, you know, Jeff, you shouldn't beat yourself up over that because you had to do that. You had to go through those processes. I know your mind. I know how you think because we are like family now. And he's like, you had to try everything you could to fix it, to try to change things, to try to, because it was like the old saying, like, well, this is your bed. Now you have to lie in it. That's how I felt like. And it was, I don't like the word fear, even though it's real, fear is real and all that. And I don't like saying I was scared or anything like that. But I had a lot of concerns leaving because yeah, you would lose everybody that you knew. For me, it was a little even more complicated because my business and career were wrapped up into this. I was running the record label for the organization. That was my job. Um, and I'd built up a very successful business in that world as well. So, and I was so high profile because I'd been in all these films and on the news and everything else. That's all I was ever known for. My entire adult life was wrapped up in this. So, and I wasn't verbalizing this stuff to anybody because it was internalizing everything. You can't trust anybody. So who are you going to talk to? Like I could tell you the people I was talking to when I was trying to make the decision to leave, you could count on one hand. My dad, a couple girlfriends, the filmmaker I mentioned, and I think there was one other person, and that was it. 5 people. Like that's all that really knew that I was trying to make this break. And because if you tell people in the movement, they're just going to try to pull you back, like um so then when I made the break and finally left, um that was had to be the hardest thing I ever did in my life because it was sort of like, what are you going to do? Like I knew I wanted to fix things. I knew I wanted to speak out against it and I was planning on doing that, but you can't just like leave and then immediately speak out. It's like I had to process things. So that was the hardest period of my life, was not having that mission, not having a purpose, and then just being there, like running a nationwide organization with international chapters. It was that kept me super busy. Like you didn't have time to think about yourself or internalize anything. You had to manage things. You had to run the organization. You had to babysit everybody and make decisions about who was right and who was wrong and investigate every little thing. So I was busy, busy, busy. And now I have no job. I have no nothing and no friends, no eh, I'm on my own and I'm sitting there with my thoughts. That was pure hell. I mean, that was so hard. And when I first left, I retired, and I did that intentionally. That was a tactical decision because I knew I needed the time to process things. And then when I was ready to speak out, which would have been in August or September of 19, um, I felt the time was right, and I made the announcement and launched a website and basically denounced my old life and what I did, and said that I was going to be a peace builder and things like that. And but before I did that, a friend of mine that I had for 20 years, he had called me up and he was like, I wasn't taking anybody's calls. I was ignoring all the emails and stuff that was coming in. And I had a few things I had to wrap up with the organization, with some corporate responsibilities, and there was a lawsuit going on and different things like that. So I had to talk to the board and a few people within the group, but outside of that, I didn't really talk to anybody. So I took this call from an old friend, and he's like, he's like, had tried to talk me into staying at first, but then he was like, okay, he's not staying. He's like, what are you going to do with your life, man? Like, this is who you are. This is who you've been your whole entire life. This is who everybody knows you as. Like, what do you, I mean, like, and I'm like, I don't want to hear this, man. Like, what's going on? What do you need? And he's like, this is all you're ever been known for. I'm worried about you. Like, what are you going to do with your life? Like, do you need help? Are you, like, what are you going to do? Like, this, he says, you've got leadership skills, you've got business skills, but what are you going to put on a job application? Leader of the Nazi
Mhm.
Party for 25 years, white power record label executive. That's not going to look so good. What are you going to do? And I'm like, you don't worry about it. I got it. I'll figure it out. But those were some of the fears that I had, deep down. Like, man, how, I don't know what it's like to live in the civilian world. I was at war all these years. Like, I had to learn how to be a human being again, like, and how to function in civil society because I was at war for 27 years. That's all I knew. So I had to learn what civilian life was, how to operate in it, and I had some of these skills, and I thrived in high stress environments. But again, like with that background, so all I knew is I wanted to make a difference. I still had that willingness or that drive to make a difference, and I thought, why not use the skill set that I possess to fix things, to help others, and that's what drives my mission today.
Indeed, indeed. So you just described finding work is going to be nigh and impossible because of what you've been up to the last 25 plus years. When did you decide, actually, I'm going to go to and do lectures, I'm going to go around the country and talk about this? When did you decide that next particular step?
Once I launched that website, I basically just said, I want to be a peace builder, but I didn't know what that looked like. I just knew that's what I wanted to do, and I wanted to help other people like leave extremist groups and things like that. And I had gotten email from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is a huh, international Jewish human rights organization. And in the movement, I knew who the Simon Wiesenthal Center was because they had been involved in some of the Nazi hunting down old war criminals and things like that. So I was aware of who they were. And I remember seeing that email and just going, uh-oh, maybe they're coming for me or something now,
Mhm.
and but that was way in the back of my head, like I didn't really think that, but it was like a what if, because I always was prepared for worst case scenarios under any circumstances, because that's basically how I survived all those years. If you didn't mentally prepare for worst case scenarios, you could panic under pressure, or you could make a mistake and end up getting killed or something. So I was always trying to stay a couple steps ahead of different things, and so I was like, well, I want to hear what they have to say. They said they're interested in meeting me, and within 2 days of that website going up, they had reached out, and within 2 days of that email, Rick Eaton from the Wiesenthal Center was on a plane to Detroit to meet with me. And I told my girl before I left, I said, I'm just letting you know, if I don't come home tonight, it means I'm on an involuntary extradition to Israel. That the Mossad has kidnapped me or something. Wiesenthal's kidnapped me,
Mhm.
and I'm being held trial in Israel. So if I don't come home, that's what happened. And I say that in my talks and stuff now, especially with the Jewish community, and get a lot of laughs about it because it's kind of funny. But that was some of the thoughts from being held over. So from that world and that life. But I remember Rick asking me, "Well, what are you going to do with your life now? What are you going to do?" And I said, I want to make a difference. I want to speak out against this, and he had asked me, he says, "Well, do you think you're ready?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I launched the website, and now I've got all the threats and everything else coming in. I'm ready. I'm ready." And he's like, "You sure? And are you sure you're ready to speak?" And I was like, I've been speaking for 25 years as the head of the NSM. This is what I do. And I was a little cocky about it. I was like, this is what I do. I can speak, no problem. It's easy. And he just kind of raised the eyebrow and he goes, I don't think it's going to be as easy as you think, Jeff. And I was like, why not? It's what I do. And he says, what you used to do is speak about politics and people, you rail against illegal immigrants and people that, were enemies of the movement, and speak about National Socialism, blah blah blah. Now you're going to be speaking about yourself. You've never done that before. And he was right. And I just remember thinking at the time, it's not going to be that hard. Oh, I was so wrong. I never doubted Rick again after that, because I went to a I spoke at a California assembly on hate crimes with like senators and different people that were looking at passing laws for different things in this, and the area that we were in California. I wasn't thinking much about it until I was there. I had a couple, little note card with a couple little talking points on it, which is the same way I always spoke in the movement. Just get my talking points, and that's it. Everything else comes from the heart. So I'm sitting there, and just before I went up there onto the panel, somebody had said, how does it feel being back in this area again? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, this is the area that NSM was highly active in California. I had actually been in that area as well. And the local groups or the state groups out there were really active. And I totally disassociated that, or didn't think about that until somebody mentioned it just before I went on the thing. I was like, holy cow, like, yeah, like, this was an area we were active in. The community here was probably damaged by the organization. Certainly people here have had run-ins with the movement or something like that down here. So I'm like, man, I just got to crumple up my note card, and I owe these people an apology. So I was like, yeah, I gave an apology for, who I was, and for any trauma that I might have caused the community there. And then I went on with the things that I felt would be helpful to the hearing and stuff like that. But it wasn't easy, because he Rick was right. I wasn't used to talking about myself. That was never something that I had to do. And in that world, I was the guy that was the commander, was always right in the eyes of the membership, typically, so I was really wrong. But in the eyes of the membership, my word was law. So it was like, now I'm getting up in front of people, especially people that I've wronged, and saying, hey, not only was I wrong, but I'm sorry, and I was really wrong, and here I'm trying to fix it. That was something it was is about as foreign to me as speaking a language I never heard before.
Mhm.
It was so hard. It's still hard. It gets easier, I think, after a while, but it's still difficult. I think, as just men in general, it's hard for us to admit they're wrong, you know. So, but getting up in front of a whole crowd of people and admitting you're wrong is even harder.
Yeah, I'll bet. But it's like, because I've chaired debates before on certain things, and it's something you just develop and you get used to, and it's a skill that grows, and yeah, you just get better with like any skill really. So full props to you on that, because I know what me chairing a debate is different to you actually going on stage and talk about your own personal life. So full props for you for doing that. Is this basically your full-time occupation now? Do you just go across the country? And actually, have you been abroad and spoken about your experiences as well?
Yeah, I go all over. Excuse me, I go all over the United States, and I've also been abroad. Actually, my first speech before the one in California was in Turkey, in Ankara.
Okay.
So that was my first international speech, and then I went to California with the Wiesenthal Center after that, and that was both in 2019. I've also spoken at the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo, Norway, which every time I think about it, it sort of raises the hairs up on the
Yeah.
back of my neck. I remember the director of the center giving me a personal tour of the Nobel Peace Center, and I said to her, I said, I never thought in a million years I would be in this place, much less getting a personal tour of it. I said, I didn't even think I'd be able to walk through that door of the Nobel Peace Center. Like that is, I mean, that's I'd say one of the proudest achievements of my life. I think to be able to do that, to come from the darkness that I was in to do that. So yeah, so I go all over the world, wherever I can make a difference. I've spoken to different governments here also and abroad about ways we can combat extremism. And with the book coming out, which is called American Nazi: From Hate to Humanity, we're looking at a book tour across the United States, also Australia, um, probably Canada and England as well.
Very cool. I mean, it's been a fascinating interview, just hearing your journey and whatnot. And just based on the chapter I read, I'd highly recommend people buy your book. Um, you kind of mentioned this before because you're coming towards the end, but if people want to find out about your work, where can they go to?
Um, I started a nonprofit, 501(c)(3) nonprofit called Beyond Barriers. So you can go to beyondbarriersusa.org and check out our work there. We help people get out of gangs, extremist groups, religious extremism, and repurpose their lives. Otherwise, jeffscoop.com. You can pre-order the book there right now, or it's out June 24th of 2025, um, global release, and you can pre-order it or get it there and check out all the wonderful work we're doing.
I'll leave a description of the two websites you mentioned in the description below for the people watching this on YouTube. Jeff, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I know you're a busy man, so thank you for finding the time to come onto the podcast to talk about this. It's been a real pleasure, definitely an eye opener. Thank you.
It's been an honor, Chris. Thanks so much for having me.